Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this evening's PILC panel, Protecting Oregon's Wild and Scenic Rivers. My name is Claire Money, and I'm a 1L representative for the PILC for the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, and I will be moderating this panel. Just a quick note before we get started. If you're a legal professional and are looking to receive CLE credit, this panel is pending CLE accreditation, so please fill out the JOT form if you haven't already done so. A PILC representative will drop the link to that form in the YouTube chat now. And you will also need to fill out our attendance form for either Oregon or out-of-state attorneys, and those links will also be provided in the chat right now. Additionally, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps provide stipends for students who are doing unpaid environmental law internships for the public interest. If you're interested in making a donation to help provide stipends to students, you may do so in one of two ways, either through PayPal or Network for Good, and both of those links will get dropped in the chat right now too. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop any questions in the YouTube chat. We'll save them for the end and have a Q&A session at the end. So now I'll just give a quick presentation to our panelists before they get started. Eric Fernandez is the Wilderness Program Manager at Oregon Wild. Since the late 90s, he has been working to protect Oregon's natural treasures. Eric has led or been involved in successful campaigns to protect natural areas throughout Oregon. When he's not developing maps or talking to politicians, Eric is out in the field leading Oregon Wild members and the public on nature hikes to the special places they seek to protect. And we also have Jenna Goodman Campbell, who is Oregon Natural Deserts Association Stewardship Director, who engages ONDA's community and hands-on restoration projects that improve desert habitat in key watersheds and migration corridors. Jenna has been a member of the ONDA staff since 2007, starting as Badlands Wilderness Coordinator. Growing up in Portland, Jenna enjoyed exploring the wetlands and rivers around her home. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in political science from Colorado College with a focus on international conflict resolution. Jenna was elected to a 4-year term in the Bend City Council in November of 2018. When she's not out exploring public lands, Jenna enjoys drawing, cooking, and chasing after her young daughter. So now I'm gonna turn it over to Jenna to begin the discussion.
Thanks, Claire. Hopefully my young daughter won't be making an appearance in the room tonight while I'm presenting, but you never know. It's always exciting, part of presenting at home. So hi, everyone. Once again, my name is Jenna Goodman Campbell, and I'm the Stewardship Director for the Oregon Natural Desert Association. Eric and Claire, if you are seeing my presenter view, please give me a heads up.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on, actually, I'll give a little explanation to this picture. This is me at the confluence of Lower Waichus Creek and the middle of the Chutes Wild and Scenic River. This is one of my favorite places in the world, and I've spent really over a decade now of my career at ONDA working to protect this place. So I'm really excited that Lower Waichus Creek is in the bill we're going to be talking about, the River Democracy Act, to be protected as a wild and scenic river. So first, I'm just going to go over some background and talk about what is a wild and scenic river. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was enacted in 1968, and the purpose was to preserve certain rivers with outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values in a free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. And under the Act, Congress can protect rivers, of course, but they can also protect creeks of all sizes and actually small lakes as well as wild and scenic rivers. And we have all of the different varieties of water bodies in the River Democracy Act that can be protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So while we might not think of dam building as a huge threat today, I'm just going to play this kind of animation here. You can see this is 1800 through 2003. And when the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed in 1968, the nation was just in this dam building mania. There were 70,000 dams already constructed in the US and 10,000 more in the works. And this led tribal leaders, scientists, and conservationists to come together around this idea of protecting free-flowing rivers. And they were concerned that without action, there would be no free-flowing rivers remaining in the US. And upon signing the act, President Lyndon Johnson said, "An unspoiled river is a very rare thing in this nation today. Their flow and vitality have been harnessed by dams, and too often they have been turned into open sewers by communities and by industries. It makes us all very fearful that all rivers will go this way unless somebody acts now." So just some quick background notes about wild and scenic rivers. For those of you who are familiar with designations like wilderness, wild and scenic river is different in that it's not managed according to one kind of common set of rules. Each river's management plan is unique to the values of that river. The only common rule is that you cannot build any new dams on a wild and scenic river. However, in Oregon, we also have some of our wild and scenic rivers where mining is not allowed. And in the River Democracy Act, it would disallow mining on all of the new segments added, which is really exciting. So as you can see here, wild and scenic river management planning that happens after designation is a really important part of the process in protecting wild and scenic rivers. And so a lot of what you can or can't do on a wild and scenic river depends on what comes out of the management plan. And this is also a really important time for activists and people who care about wild rivers to be engaged in the process all the way through, kind of the bill being introduced and deciding what rivers are included in the bill up until the river management plan is released. And I'll also note that this is a public process. So it's a really great time, as I said, to be involved, and especially for local communities to have a say in how the river is managed. So you might have heard me mention outstandingly remarkable values. We also shorten that to ORVs. This is a really important part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and any wild and scenic river designation is the outstandingly remarkable values of the river. And these can include a lot of different things. There's kind of a common set of ORVs that are often protected in wild and scenic rivers, but they can also include more creative things. Maybe Eric will be able to mention some of the creative ORVs that are in the River Democracy Act. But wildlife is a really common one, and this is obviously a really big one for Oregon's high desert. Desert streams provide critical habitat for sensitive and endangered species like sage grouse, golden eagles, and bighorn sheep, shown here in the John Day River, I believe. Of course, fish, desert rivers and rivers throughout the state provide critical habitat for many species of fish. I'd say it's probably the most common, outstandingly remarkable value of wild and scenic rivers. Many wild and scenic rivers are also protected for cultural values, and they hold immeasurable value and significance for Indigenous people today. And the rivers and creeks that I'm speaking about today are within the homelands of the Northern Paiute, Wasco, and Warm Springs tribes. There are also many sacred cultural sites along these rivers, and they provide important places for Indigenous people to hunt, fish, and gather plants for food and medicine. The last two slides have pictures of ONDA's 2019 Tribal Stewards crew who spent time working on the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and Steens Mountain. Geological values are also another big one. Here you see one of the classic glaciated kind of U-shaped gorges of Steens Mountain. This particular creek, Big Indian Creek, was protected with a geological value. And recreation, of course. Recreation uses of wild and scenic rivers are many and varied, and again, depend on that management plan. Recreational uses of a lot of wild and scenic rivers are non-motorized. So we always work as conservationists to protect the kind of wilderness experience that's becoming so rare these days, but especially along our wild rivers. And then one other thing I'll mention about wild and scenic river designation is the different classifications that you can have on a wild and scenic river. So the first one is recreational rivers, and those are really the most accessible. You kind of have a variety of different kind of levels of accessibility and different activities that are allowed in wild and scenic rivers, partially based on the classification. So recreational rivers often will have a road running all the way along them, or they'll have multiple road accesses throughout the course of the river. Here you see some folks camping on the crooked wild and scenic river here in Central Oregon. Scenic rivers have kind of more of a immersive river experience, but you still have road access points in many places. And then wild rivers are the most remote, kind of the wilderness experience with no road access and a focus on kind of non-motorized recreation and access, things like rafting, backpacking, hiking, and horseback riding. Another thing that's really important to note is that restoration is allowed on wild and scenic rivers, and it can be a really important component of their management. And it's going to be a really important part, I think, of the management of a lot of the rivers that are hopefully going to be designated as a part of the River Democracy Act that Eric is going to be talking more about in just a minute. Another thing to note is that rivers that flow through, wild and scenic rivers that flow through private land do not impact private property rights. So the only thing that they impact there is whether or not you can build a dam on that river. And then existing water rights are also unchanged, and things like firefighting and fire management is not impacted by a wild and scenic river. And then things like livestock raising can also continue as long as they're not negatively impacting that river's outstandingly remarkable values. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric so that he can talk about this exciting opportunity we have in front of us with the River Democracy Act.
Great. Thanks, Jenna. I'm going to get on my screen share here. If you can stay on for just a second, make sure my screen's looking as it should. How's that look? Great. All right. Well, so good evening, everyone. Here to talk a little bit about the River Democracy Act that Jenna mentioned a few minutes ago. And after we do a little bit of nuts and bolts, Jenna and I will take you on a little bit of a tour of some of the rivers around the state that are proposed for wild and scenic river protection as a part of that legislation. And that legislation was introduced by Senators Wyden and Merkley just about, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now. So pretty exciting time to be working on river conservation in Oregon. And here's one of the rivers in this photo. This is Odell Creek here in Central Oregon on the Deschutes National Forest, right near Davis Lake. Great campground. Highly recommend checking it out. So how did we get here? It's been a pretty fascinating process. I've been doing this kind of work for 20 plus years now, and this has really been a pretty unique process where it was really a grassroots type of an effort. So go back a year and a half ago, Senator Wyden announced that he wanted to do to hold a nomination process where Oregonians from across the state could nominate any river, their favorite rivers, for wild and scenic river protection. So anyone and everyone who wanted to could say, let's nominate Tumalo Creek or Owyhee or Waichus or Upper Willamette. And they, Senator Wyden had, I think he ended up getting, it looks like 15,000 nominations for different rivers. Thousands of people participated. They had a comment period where you could do it via email. They also had public town halls. This photo here is the town hall here in Central Oregon that happened. And as you can see, it was kind of a cross section of all Oregonians. This little fella here, 10-year-old, my neighbor, he's rafted more rivers than most people, triple his age. And then you got people wearing cowboy hats. So it was really an interesting experience to be a part of that nomination process in those town halls. And so that all kicked off about a year and a half ago. And then fast forward, and we ended up here a couple of weeks ago with that introduced legislation. And so here's a map of Oregon. So you can see the blue lines are the proposed wild and scenic rivers. The purple lines here are already designated wild and scenic rivers. So you've got the Deschutes River here, the John Day River here, I-5 corridor over here, Rogue Rivers down here, Crater Lake up here. So it gives you a little bit of orientation. So 4,700 miles sounds like a lot of miles, but when you put it in context, that's right now only 2% of Oregon's rivers have been protected as wild and scenic. And if this legislation were to go through exactly as it was introduced, which isn't going to happen, there's going to be compromises and negotiations and discussions and more input probably from people all across the state saying, you forgot my river, or I don't know about that river. But if it were to go through as is right now, we would go from having 2% of our rivers in Oregon protected as wild and scenic to 6%. So it's still a pretty modest proposal. And that's because Oregon we have a lot of streams. This map here, I put it together and I drew the lines as thin as I could for each stream, but with 110,000 miles of streams, that's just, 6% is significant. And that 6% is some of the best, most important, most charismatic, scenic, important rivers that we have. But again, it kind of puts it in context there. So pretty significant. It is a historic effort. The scale of this legislation is something we haven't seen for river protection in Oregon before. So that's pretty exciting. But we're a little behind the curve as far as how many of our rivers had already been protected. One thing you might be curious about is, just how much support is there for protecting wild and scenic rivers? There's going to be a political battle. There was a poll done, very encouraging, just 2 months ago, I think. And it showed that 87% of Oregonians support wild and scenic river protections. And that includes 75% of Republicans. So those poll numbers are so high. I don't think anything has polled that high since they asked people if they like potato chips. So this is a pretty exciting level of support. And I'm cautiously optimistic, maybe naively optimistic. These are pretty partisan times, but I'm hoping that bipartisan support for protecting our river heritage helps move this legislation through Congress smoother than some other legislation we've seen in recent years. And while I'm on this slide, I just highlight this photo here is one of the rivers proposed for wild and scenic rivers designation. This is the South Fork Umatilla up in Northeast Oregon. And if you look closely at that photo, you'll see there is a moose in that photo. So South Fork, we have moose in Oregon. Most people don't realize that. Not very many. And the ones that we do have are up very much in the northeast corner of the state, close to the Washington border. Somebody got very lucky, got a moose walking right up the creek. That doesn't happen very often. So with that, I want to start our tour of what proposed wild and scenic rivers and kind of pause here on this first one, which is I work out of our Oregon Wild Bend office here in Central Oregon. And so this river here, Tumalo Creek, is close to home for me. And I think one of the things that has brought so much support to this proposal so far is, this crazy time that we've been in for the last year and a half or last year with the pandemic. And I think it's really given us a new, certainly for me, and I know I've heard this from a lot of other people as well, a newfound appreciation for our wild places and our public lands and rivers, to be able to have somewhere that we can go to just disconnect, be out in nature, forget there's a pandemic and crazy politics going on, and just hang out in nature, stop doom scrolling on your phone, hike along a trail, float along a trail, or float along a river. And as Jenna mentioned, there's a lot of things you can do in a wild and scenic river corridor. You can go hiking, hunting, camping, fishing, rafting, canoeing, kayaking, trail running. If your thing is recreational bulldozing, not so much encouraged in a wild and scenic river corridor. Clear cutting old growth forest, not so much encouraged in wild and scenic river corridors. But again, kind of coming back to this photo here with Tumalo Falls and Tumalo Creek, it's amazing for a variety of reasons, the recreational opportunities. But again, kind of this connection to the pandemic is interesting because I feel like there's also this newfound appreciation for some of the basics in life, healthcare. Is it safe to go to the grocery store? Clean drinking water. And one of the biggest motivations of this legislation is to protect our sources of clean drinking water. And the upper headwaters of Tumalo Creek provides clean water for folks who live in Bend. So that's a prime motivator for some people for why we should protect it. It's also important if you like beer. So we've seen a lot of support for protecting these rivers from breweries in places like Bend, where there's a very intense understanding of the importance of having dependable, clean water. Because if you don't have dependable, clean water, it's harder to make good beer. So your passion may be for salmon and steelhead, and that's why you want to protect rivers, or maybe it's beer, and there's something in this for everyone. So Tumalo Creek, again, kind of it has all of those values, from wildlife values in the headwaters to providing clean drinking water to Central Oregonians in Bend, to some pretty scenic views. People float the river downstream, great hiking. You can snowshoe, you can see, if you look closely here, right up above the falls, you can kind of hike up along the ridge here, all the way right up to here, and pretty much you're looking right down on the waterfall. It's pretty spectacular. Great place. Love Tumalo Falls. This has been one of those places where during the pandemic, this is close to home. It's been easy to get out to. So that's been very nice. I hope everybody else has been able to find similar plans, somewhere in nature to escape during these challenging times. Because it can really be important for mental health and sanity, and also just fun. So continuing our tour, moving from Central Oregon up to the greater Portland area here, we've got the Oak Grove Fork of the Clackamas. And this is, totally different landscape. This is one of the cool things about Oregon, between the rivers I'm showing you and the ones Jenna has already shown and will show coming up. We have an amazing diversity of landscapes here in Oregon, and our rivers come in all flavors and sizes and shapes and colors. So the Clackamas is a much more west side type of river. Also really important for clean drinking water. The Clackamas watershed is a water source for anyone who lives in Lake Oswego, Westland, Oregon City, Estacada, and a few other towns. So really important for that reason. And there are a couple of different forks, the South Fork of the Clackamas and some other tributaries that are a part of this proposal. Again, kind of following the science that if all you do is protect a narrow strip along a river corridor, along the main stem, that science tells us that's not really enough. You really want to protect as much of the watershed and larger buffers around our rivers. So that's part of the strategy with this legislation, is to protect the most important streams and a substantial buffer around those rivers. So there we go, Oak Grove Fork, Clackamas, and then we'll bounce out to the Coast Range here. This is Drift Creek. Talk about lush water, forests, and everything. What's really exciting about this is Oregon does not have a lot of protected rivers in the Coast Range. The rivers that we have protected we've got some pockets where we've protected more than others, but very, very few in the Coast Range. So I'm excited to see that that's changing, whether we're talking about part of the Yachats River, Alsea River, part of the Middle Upper Trask River, or Drift Creek here, one of the more spectacular rivers we've got in the Coast Range. And then moving down the Coast Range here, this is Kentucky Falls, and this is actually flows into eventually down into the Umpqua River, which is another one of Oregon's big iconic rivers. And this is, you can hike right to that lookout you're seeing there. Again, very lush, very different. And these Coast Range rivers have maybe different values than some of the other rivers around the state. Here you have much higher density and more, just more fish in the rivers. So salmon and steelhead, that might be the prime motivator for why some of these rivers in the Coast Range were nominated and got included in the legislation. Going on down the Coast Range here, you get to Indigo Creek. This is one that's a little more off the beaten track. You've probably not heard of it. Flows down eventually into the Rogue River. This is in the Siskiyou region of Oregon, which is one of the most unique parts of the state. Again, we've got lots of variety. There's probably nowhere that has more variety than the Siskiyous and the rivers there. One of the creeks there is Rough and Ready Creek, and that has and that's the upper Illinois River watershed there that has more different types of plants than anywhere else in the state. Lots of different plants that are found nowhere else on the planet. And Indigo Creek here is great for some pretty hardcore kayaking, but also just a pretty neat landscape. One of the reasons that area has such diversity, biodiversity, is that it missed the last ice age. So the plants and everything there have been evolving for a much longer time than in other parts of the states, like the Cascades or the Coast Range or other parts. So that's Indigo Creek, sweet spot. And then kind of moving back up into the Cascades, speaking of, we've got the McKenzie River. Part of the McKenzie River is already protected as wild and scenic, but this stretch is not. This is near the, if you've ever spent some time on the McKenzie River, this is up near Paradise Campground. Beautiful water, just that turquoise green. I hope it's coming through on your screen. Love hanging out here. I think I took this last summer, maybe the summer before. Great spot. And again, the McKenzie is one of those streams that has a lot of values. Salmon, steelhead, it's a famous mountain biking trail, hiking trail, old growth forests, scenic views, provides clean drinking water to Eugene and Springfield. So pretty, lots and lots of different reasons for protecting the McKenzie River. And there was, folks might be curious, there was some fire on some of these rivers in the Labor Day fires we had this past summer. And so that's consistent, there's not a conflict there with wild and scenic designation. You can still do any restorations that's needed. And as Jenna said, you can do fight fires in wild and scenic river corridors. So hopefully the combination of restoration that's already underway and maybe more restoration in the future, and then protecting those natural areas. A lot of times we think we know best, but a lot of times nature will take care of those areas best after a fire. Give you some of the more well-known areas and streams and rivers, but we'll also do a few obscure ones here before I'm done. So Crane Creek being one of those obscure ones. This is on the Fremont-Wainema National Forest. And, again, a totally different landscape. Western Oregon, you have your lush Douglas fir, cedar forests over here. This is South Central Oregon. Crane Creek, you've got much more the ponderosa pine type forest and a lot fewer streams and rivers. So the ones that are there are all the more important for the red band trout and other fish you might have in the stream, and for other wildlife that need those water sources and depend on them. And then scooting up to Northeast Oregon, this is a slightly crooked version, so tilt your head a little bit here. These mountains here that you see in the foreground are the south end of the Wallowa Mountains. So we're kind of looking sort of from the Idaho side into Oregon. There's a big valley, and then back in the distance here, I think this is like the Elkhorn Crest. So down through the valley here, you've got the Naha River already protected as wild and scenic. What this legislation would do, again, is protect more of the key tributaries that provide the cold, clean water for some of these larger rivers. All right, so, and yeah, Lake Fork Creek and a couple of others are in here. There's a famous tree up in these mountains here, the limber pine. That's one of the oldest trees in Oregon. If I actually, it might be the oldest tree in Oregon. Pretty neat stories on that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jenna here. My last photo is the North Fork Willamette River. Again, kind of lush. This is in the, if you know Highway 58 out of Eugene. That'll take you through the upper Willamette and the north, get you to the North Fork, and some good trails, good waterfalls, great place to check out. And again, those headwaters of the Willamette River, if you protect the headwaters, you at least have protected the source that then comes down through Eugene and Portland. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna. And I will stop my screen share. There you go.
Thanks, Eric. I'm always excited to do these presentations because I learn about a new place that I want to go. And so now it's Kentucky Falls. That's my on my list again. All right, we'll pick back up where I left off. So now I'm going to talk about some of the proposed wild and scenic rivers in Oregon's high desert. This is the lower Owyhee River. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it is on the list. For those of you who haven't heard of or been to the Owyhee, you ought to check it out. It's sometimes called Oregon's Grand Canyon. It's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to start with a couple of other key tributaries, like what Eric was talking about. The South Fork of the Crooked River is one of them. You may not have heard of this one. Maybe you've heard of the Crooked River, runs through Smith Rock State Park, and then goes to meet up with the Deschutes at Lake Billy Chinook. The South Fork Crooked River is southeast of Prineville, and it's just a really amazingly wild place. It's pretty much roadless, just a couple of dirt 2-track roads, and it's really important habitat for red band trout and would be habitat for salmon and steelhead, but for just one dam, I believe that we still need fish passage on so that they can make it up to the South Fork Crooked River. It's also been the site of really incredible restoration. ONDA volunteers have donated thousands of hours of their time planting over 20,000 native trees and shrubs along the South Fork Crooked River. So it's really a work in progress, but with places like the South Fork, it really reminds us that it's not just kind of the current state of these rivers that makes them wild, but also their potential to really thrive if we set them up, to do so, and we give them the protection that they need and deserve. Next, I'll move over to Lower Waichus Creek, another restoration success story. Waichus Creek is a really vital tributary to the Deschutes River. It puts a lot of cold, clean, clear water into the Deschutes, and it's right upstream from the Pelton Round Butte Dam complex that creates Lake Billy Chinook. So this is really the first spawning habitat that salmon and steelhead reach in the Upper Deschutes Basin as they make their way out of that old dam complex, which you may have heard is the restoration there has been pretty intense and very expensive. I think over $100 million now the community has invested into getting salmon and steelhead back into this stream. This is right below Alder Springs, which is one of the biggest spring complexes in the area, but this area is one of the things that makes it so important for salmon and steelhead is all of the cold water springs that enter in this stretch. So a little story, this is the Bend High School Environmental Club. When Senator Wyden announced his nomination process, some members of the club got in touch and wanted to see if they could get involved in the process and nominate one of the rivers and creeks where they've been working since they were young students. The Upper Deschutes Watershed Council does great work around restoration. This particular property that they're on here on Waichus Creek is owned by the Deschutes Land Trust, and so it's a great community partnership that they've put a lot into restoring the natural flow of this stream and restoring beaver habitat and just doing a really amazing transformation of this creek that was formerly channelized and straightened. So this is upstream from the section that would be protected as wild and scenic. This is Sydney, one of the members of the club, representing her club at that town hall meeting that Senator Wyden did in Bend. She spoke really eloquently, and after she finished, Senator Wyden said, "I will consider it." And sure enough, Waichus Creek is in the bill. So it's really exciting to see, as Eric said, all different types of people and different ages of people speaking up for rivers and creeks that they care about. Another one that was nominated by young people was Tumalo Creek, that was nominated by a middle school class here in Bend. And the same thing, it's these young people have been out doing restoration work and learning about ecology on these streams for their entire school careers. And so for them to be able to step up and nominate these rivers and creeks was really special. Here's just a picture of Waichus Creek right above the confluence with the Deschutes River. It's really a fantastic area for recreation as well. But this is one of the many streams in the bill that we really encouraged the outstandingly remarkable value for recreation to be quiet recreation, because as you can see here, this is a really wild place and we want to keep it that way. So while recreation is an amazing use of wild and scenic rivers, we also have some places that are really sensitive. And so we want to help the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management strike the right balance in managing these places to protect the other outstandingly remarkable values besides recreation. And then the final one that I'm going to talk about is another obscure area, I think, to a lot of people. It's the Trout Creek Mountains and the Oregon Canyon Mountains. You can see down in the southeast corner of the state, and actually a couple of the streams included in this kind of bundle down here are, they flow in and out of Nevada. This is just a view of one of the tributaries of Oregon Canyon Creek, but you can just see how rugged and remote this landscape is. The very little access to this area and super wild, really important for wildlife like sage grouse, bighorn sheep, and other wildlife. And it's also home to an endemic trout species. It's the Willow Whitehorse Basin cutthroat trout. It's a genetically unique population of Lahontan cutthroat trout, which are a genetically unique population of trout that's really adapted to thriving in these tiny desert streams. And so they've found a way to kind of make a go at it in just this specific basin. I believe it's 5 streams in the Willow Whitehorse Basin where they live. And here's a picture of Big Trout Creek. So now I'm just going to pivot quickly to talking about how you can get involved in the effort to protect all of these amazing rivers and creeks. We've really just scratched the surface here tonight to tell you about the amazing places that are in this bill and stand to be protected. So I'm just going to give you a few ideas for what you can do. The first is, of course, if you haven't already, to please go on to either ONDA's website or Oregon Wild's website and just take a quick action to thank your senators. They don't hear thank you enough. As an elected official, I can tell you, we definitely don't hear thank you enough. So it's always nice for them to receive that note, and even better if you take a few minutes to personalize it and let them know, specific streams that you're really happy to see in the bill. And I think Claire will drop an action link into the chat for a couple of these different slides in case you're interested in following up. Another great thing that you can do that actually really doesn't take very long is writing a letter to the editor. This is something that I really like to do personally because I know that elected leaders really read the opinion section, and they're especially looking for letters to the editor about their pet projects or their bills or kind of work that they're doing. And so it's a great way to kind of amplify your voice and make sure that your message is getting heard, not just in your community, but also really getting kind of attention from your elected leaders. So one thing that can be really easy to do is just to copy and paste a message that you have already sent to your senators, like your thank you message that you're going to be sending, and copy and paste that into a Word document, and then just edit and personalize it a little bit more and send it off. So we also have a link on ONDA's website, a page where we have simple instructions for writing a letter to the editor and links to different papers around the state where you can find the submission requirements. And then finally, of course, you can become a member of Oregon Wild or ONDA, hopefully both if you're not already. It's really, really critical that we have long-term support for this effort because as Eric said, it's not going to be easy to get this bill across the finish line in its current form with all of these really amazing rivers and creeks still intact in the bill. And it also, it's going to be a longer term effort than just getting the bill passed because we're all going to be involved through the management planning process until the very end of monitoring all of these wild and scenic rivers after they're designated. So I believe with that, we have some plenty of time for questions.
Thank you. I'm just finishing up sending these links in the chat.
Thank you.
And I know that we do have a few questions that have been coming in. So first of all, if this bill is introduced by 2 Oregon senators to the federal Congress, how do Senators Wyden and Merkley convince other senators of the importance of the bill to Oregonians?
Do you want to take that one, Jenna?
Got a pretty good start. I think that the way that Senator Wyden set up the nomination process was really strategic, because he can just go to that and show, how important it is to Oregonians just by the sheer number of nominations he got, and then also the number of personal nominations they got from people around the state saying how important these rivers and creeks are to them.
Yeah, and I would just add, to the question of, how do Senator Wyden and Merkley, how do they persuade other members of Congress? That whole congressional process it's not a fast overnight process, which is the frustrating part. The good part is once an area is protected by Congress, it's actually even harder to undo it. So it's a really meaningful way to protect our public lands and our natural heritage for future generations. So that's the exciting part. And Senator Wyden, he and Senator Merkley are capable of some serious arm twisting around. They're not the most recent additions to Congress, so they have some clout built up, hopefully. And it's our job to show them that there is enough support for this legislation that they're feeling inspired to help move this through Congress. If it's just, hey, cool, that's a good bill, and we all walk away, that bill's probably not going anywhere. So we'll need to keep the pressure on them. If this bill hasn't passed in a year or two, we'll have to start asking them why. So yeah, they oftentimes refer to legislative process in Washington, D.C. as watching the sausage being made, and watching sausage being made is a nasty, ugly process. I'm a vegetarian, but I've done it with my hands. And so, those negotiations in DC are not always pretty, and most of the outcomes on this legislation will hopefully be good. We're at a really good starting point. And so it's up to Oregon Wild and ONDA, and there's a whole lot of other organizations out there working on this, and a whole lot of Oregonians who nominated rivers to make sure that this legislation stays strong and all the way across the finish line.
Thank you. Our next question is, when a river is designated as wild and scenic, is that legislation enforced in perpetuity, or can it be revoked by introducing another bill that would strip it of its designation?
Yeah, I think I may have sort of hinted at the answer to that one. So, anything Congress passes in legislation, they can always unpass it by passing future legislation. That's not a common thing, not something we've seen a lot of in Oregon, with whether it's wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, national parks. It can happen. These types of battles you sometimes see in other places like Alaska, where you have to fight to hold on to those designations sometimes. But here in Oregon, I would feel pretty confident that if the legislation passed, that those streams and rivers would be protected for perpetuity. So, thinking 7 generations ahead, I like the odds, but there are no guarantees.
Thank you. And we have one more question. Can only rivers on federal land be designated, or can rivers through state forests also be protected through this?
So rivers through state forests or private land, or any other land ownership, can be designated as wild and scenic, but the protection doesn't apply anywhere outside the river on those lands. So and there are some rivers flowing through state lands in the high desert, for example, that are in this bill, but that will only impact the river itself. So the designation has the most kind of power on public land, because that's where you get the whole management plan for that. In this case, the entire mile-wide corridor.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit to that. Congress can't tell the state how to manage their lands. So if you have a state forest, for example, and you can certainly protect a wild and scenic river there, but the separation of powers and all that good stuff. And it goes both ways. The state can't tell the feds how to manage the national forest land and national parks, and thank goodness in some cases. So there's that. And then on private lands, I think Jenna covered that really well. It's what's interesting is in the past there were a lot of wild and scenic river designations on private land. That was a fairly common thing, and people understood it. So there's a long track record of understanding that does, for better or for worse, that doesn't change what people can and can't do on their private lands. Nowadays, like this legislation is really geared towards just focusing on the public lands and the federal public lands. So that's primarily going to be in Oregon, our national forests and our Bureau of Land Management lands. We do have another designation in Oregon that can be used and useful for state lands. It's called the State Scenic Waterway designation. So it's kind of the state companion to the federal legislation. And that's most helpful if you're looking at state forests to use that designation. And we've had new designations of state scenic waterways. We worked on a couple different rivers over the last 10 years or so. That program seems to be on pause a little bit at the state level, unfortunately. I think there was some staff turnover and then the pandemic hit. So, but yeah, there's always different tools when it comes to protecting our rivers and our old growth forests and our clean drinking water. Sometimes the wild and scenic river tool works best. Sometimes wilderness works best. Sometimes state scenic waterway. There's national recreation areas, lots of different ways to do it. The one thing I do like about wild and scenic river designation is it's pretty strong. It's not quite as strong as wilderness, but it's pretty strong. So it's not like some designations where it can be undone. Every time there's a new administration or a new forest supervisor. So wild and scenic is it's pretty solid, pretty good for our rivers.
Great, thank you. We don't have any more questions coming at you in the chat. So I'll wait a couple more minutes maybe and see if anybody wants to ask anything in the audience. But other than that, if you guys have any concluding thoughts.
I'll just say, please go to the link that the links that we provided and take a minute to thank your senators for this amazing bill. It's really exciting to see a bill of this magnitude, but also to see that it was developed by Oregonians. That's, I think, something that is really historic about this bill.
Yeah, I think Jenna hits the nail on the head. It's nice and fun to see pretty pictures and go hike and float these rivers, but take that extra few minutes to click those links, become a member, thank your senators, write that letter to the editor, because these rivers don't protect themselves. It takes all of us to protect these rivers. So and it's if you're into rivers, this is a time to celebrate. This is good news. We're not at the finish line yet, but this is really good news for clean drinking water, wildlife habitat, world-class recreational opportunities on our public lands. So we don't have a lot of these moments with working on environmental issues. So we need to enjoy this a little bit and then hopefully be inspired to, as Jen said, click that link.
Awesome. We did have one more question come in. Are there any other major pieces of legislation we should be looking for beyond rivers? Anything in the State House or Senate regarding environmental protection?
And thus starts the next 3-hour panel on legislation at the state and national level.
I've got a fun one. It is, so there's a bill in the Oregon State Legislature to ban the trapping and hunting of beaver on public land. So it might not seem super important at first glance, but it's actually got a ton of support throughout the state. It's House Bill 2843. And there's actually a few different beaver bills that are in the mix in the state legislature this year. So I know I'm talking to a bunch of ducks, but the beaver bill, it's exciting. There's a lot of really great things going on across the state and really across the country with beaver restoration and working alongside beaver to restore rural riparian landscapes. So it's they are a really important tool, but we can't we can't work alongside them if they're not on the landscape. So this is a really important bill to get more beaver back on our public lands.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, this is one of those classic questions where I'm guessing Jen and I will both think of like 4 other pieces of legislation that, I should have mentioned. But off the top of my head, there's at the state legislature, there's a couple of bills that Oregon Wild is tracking. One is, the perennial coyote killing contest legislation. So that's one to keep track of. There's another new one this year that's really interesting. We have this agency, this public agency. This is such a weird thing. Oregon Forest Resource Institute, which is a mouthful. It's often just called OFRI. They're the ones who do all those commercials about how awesome we are with our forestry protection rules here in Oregon. And yet we are in the dark ages compared to all neighboring states. So this legislation would get rid of that agency and stop using taxpayer dollars to basically greenwash the clear cutting of Oregon's forests. So that's a step in the right direction. We'd love to see that move forward. So yeah, there's a mix of good bills and bad bills, and at the state level. At the federal level, there's a little bit of good news from just in the last couple of days. A shout out to Congressman DeFazio. He was able to get legislation onto a package moving through the U.S. House of Representatives. A bunch of different bills are making their way and were voted on out of the House. He was able to get attached to that protections for some streams and watersheds in Southwest Oregon to protect them from mining. This is legislation that's been around for a number of years now. Southwest Oregon, because it's such that unique landscape that I mentioned earlier, it is threatened by mining. And so it's great to see that there are some protections from mining starting to move through Congress. So still need it to pass the Senate, but it's a big step forward. And again, credit to DeFazio for making that happen. So yeah, lots of others. There's not in the legislative front, but the appointment of Deb Haaland for the Interior Secretary of that covers a lot of the vast majority of our public lands. Well, not all of them, but a good percentage of them. So that's pretty exciting. Native American woman, smart, savvy. So that would be really good news for wildlife and public lands. So that's another thing, if you're calling your senators and members of Congress, to also encourage them to vote the right way to support her nomination. So all kinds of things to keep track of, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for all the information. And you guys are getting some thank yous in the chat from attendees. And thanks for everybody for attending the panel. We have a big lineup of events all week for PILC, so please feel encouraged to come and attend all of them. And just a reminder, in the beginning, I dropped the JOT form and attendance sheet if you're looking for CLE credit from this event. So please fill those out. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks for making it happen, Claire. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thank you for having us.